CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. 2 people killed in a wave of Russian missile strikes across Ukraine. Electricity supplies knocked out in its 2 largest cities.
Our other headlines, thousands of people protest across Belgium as unions call a general strike amid the cost of living crisis.
Another strike by railway workers hits the UK as talks to try and resolve the dispute on pay and conditions fail.
And one of the biggest aquariums in the world, holding 1,500 tropical fish, explodes in the lobby of a Berlin hotel.
Russia has launched a massive missile strike across Ukraine, cutting power supplies in its second biggest city, Kharkiv, and in much of the capital, Kyiv.
2 people have been killed in a strike on a residential building in the city of Kryvyi Rih. 9 power stations have now been damaged. Ukrainian authorities say as many as 70 Russian missiles have been fired on targets across the country. These attacks come as Ukraine's defense chiefs claim the Kremlin is planning a new offensive to retake control of Kyiv in the new year. Well, Mark Kansian is a retired United States Marine colonel and senior advisor at Washington's Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mark, welcome. First of all, how likely is it that the Russian army will launch a ground offensive in the new year?
Well, it is possible that the Russians will launch an offensive somewhere. They conducted this partial mobilization beginning back in September. The mobilization was chaotic, but it has produced a lot of troops on the front lines. Most of those are coming through training now, and in the spring will be ready for operations. My personal guess is that they will try to hold the line where they are, but they will have enough military capability that they may be able to launch an offensive someplace.
The armchair generals, the commissariat, have been saying for ages that this conflict would pause over winter because historically that's what has happened in this part of the world. Is that not the case, perhaps?
Well, I think the consensus now is that fighting will continue and maneuver will continue once the ground freezes and units can move more quickly. Remember back during the Second World War, the Soviets always launched a winter offensive. This war began in February. So I think it's likely that in a month or so, you'll see probably the Ukrainians launch an offensive.
Does the Russian military have the capacity to do this, given their recent losses?
Well, they have rebuilt their forces as a result of the partial mobilization. They've been moving a lot of equipment in. They may be able to launch an offensive. The idea of an attack on Kyiv, though, is hard to imagine. The Russians were unsuccessful doing that at the beginning of the war when they had the advantage of surprise and an unprepared Ukrainian military. Now the Ukrainian military is prepared. It's pretty well equipped. It's getting better trained all the time. Belarus is trying to keep its distance. So I think an offensive from that direction is unlikely.
If you sense that retaking Kyiv is not an option, which areas will Russia target?
It's probably in the Donbass. They've continued offensive operations around a town called Bakhmut, which is on the southern part of the Donbass. They really want to retake both of those provinces. So my guess is that they would launch an offensive somewhere in that vicinity.
Can we just turn our focus in the other direction, if I might put it like that, for a moment, and talk about the United States and perhaps Western allies? How do you sense their support is in regard to support for Ukraine?
Well, support seems to be holding up. The United States the U.S. Congress just passed its authorization bill, which had strong support for Ukraine. That was bipartisan. On the other hand, Putin is clearly hoping that civilian morale will crack. We've been hearing, for example, about general strikes as a result of high cost of living. Putin's hoping that populations will demand negotiations. Those negotiations would probably lead to an in-place ceasefire, which would help Russia. The aid packages are continuing, though. The big news there, of course, is the United States is sending the Patriot air defense system.
And do you sense the Patriot decision will make a substantial difference in the conduct of this campaign?
Well, the Patriot is not a game changer. You know, they're sending one battery, which can basically protect one city. It can't protect against all air threats. On the other hand, it's a very sophisticated, very capable system, so it will help. I think the biggest thing is twofold. It will reassure the Ukrainian public that the United States and its own government are doing everything they can, and it's a very visible sign of the U.S. commitment to the Ukrainian resistance.
Mark, good to talk to you. Thank you very much for coming back on the programme. Mark Kansian, former US Marine Colonel and Senior Advisor at Washington Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Well, let's take you to Moscow now and talk to our correspondent, Stuart Smith. So, Stuart, has there been any comment from the Kremlin on these latest attacks and the claims from Ukraine?
Yeah, not from the Kremlin or, interestingly, from the Ministry of Defense on what caused these massive power outages in Ukraine. But the news filtering through to Russian media that earlier in the afternoon, over 50% of Ukraine's interconnected energy grid was put out of action, and that being presented here in Russia as a success. Also more detail, though, coming from Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, who provided for the first time since the so-called special military operation a detailed breakdown of what Russia considers targets which are legitimate in this fight for Russia. He suggested that infrastructure as varied as bridges, transport stations, roads, energy facilities, factories and workshops that carry out military orders can now be considered legitimate targets for Russia. He also suggested the military political leadership as well as the armed forces of any allies of Ukraine that are present in the country. It's a broad list spelled out for the first time by Dmitry Medvedev, showing how confident Russia has become in feeling that this action is justified as it continues its special military operation. An interesting phone call happened with the Prime Minister of India and the President of Russia earlier in the day, notably Narendra Modi asking President Putin for his assessment of quite why Russia is still conducting the special military operation. According to the Kremlin readout, President Vladimir Putin explained the rationale. Similarly, at the other end, Narendra Modi calling for diplomacy and dialogue as the only way forward for Russia now.
And Stuart, President Putin is going to visit Belarus for talks with his opposite number, Alexander Lukashenko. What can we expect from those?
That's right, for the first time in over 3 years, quite showing how important this will be for Russia. Some wondering if there will be a discussion about how Belarus can better contribute to Russia's special military operation, having kept out of it for the most part so far in terms of deploying its own resources in Ukraine, although of course allowing its territory to be used as a staging ground by the Russian military, and it continues to train Russian service personnel. And in terms of the latest military discussions going on in Belarus, there are drills being held, announced last week, which do combine the expertise of Russia's and Belarus's military. Alexander Lukashenko frequently saying he believes there's a threat from the west from NATO, or possibly a threat from the south from Ukraine, but saying he's not willing at the moment to deploy Belarusian troops to Ukraine or start any kind of mobilization progress. Another big issue for Belarus, though unrelated directly at least to the special military operation in Ukraine, is the gas situation, with Russia and Belarus very close in the so-called Union State, sharing a lot of trade and import infrastructure and contractual obligations. But Lukashenko unhappy at the moment with the way that Belarus's gas industry is being treated. He thinks it's getting an unfair deal and is something that he's very keen to talk to President Vladimir Putin about when he arrives next week.
Stuart, many thanks. Our correspondent Stuart Smith in Moscow.
A national day of strikes is taking place across Belgium, prompted by the cost of living crisis.
The country's trades unions have mobilised their members to urge the government to take action, with thousands of people coming out onto the streets.
Well, our correspondent Alex Cadier is in Brussels. Alex, this strike action coming from seemingly right across the public sector. What is it people are calling for? Is this a sign of more protests to come?
Well, it's certainly calling for more purchasing power to help deal with the cost of living crisis. That is at the core of what the protesters were saying today. 16,000 according to the police, 22,000 according to the organisers marching through the streets of Brussels, but also smaller protests being staged elsewhere in Belgium. They say we want higher salaries and we want lower energy costs. That is the crux of what is being discussed and what is being demanded by these protesters. They say the government is not doing enough. They also decried the time it is taking for the European Union to take action on energy prices, so they want the Belgian government to step in unilaterally and cap those energy prices. And those are the real core demands by these protesters. These protests are quite frequent now in Belgium. They seem to be happening monthly in the streets of Brussels. You would say that 16,000 to 22,000 is quite a low number. You'd imagine it could have been bigger. Now, don't let the blue skies fool you. It is near freezing now in Brussels, and that might have dissuaded some people to come out. But it was quite a jovial affair, a lot of music, a lot of dancing around. Despite their very serious demands, protesters are keen to be heard. One lady telling me the government is doing nothing to help us. Now, the thing to add is that salaries in Belgium are indexed to inflation. So whenever inflation goes up and whenever there's double-digit inflation like we've seen over the last few months, there will also be double-digit pay rises for a lot of workers in Belgium. So that's a measure put in place already. The government also helping individuals and households to the tune of €200 a month in November and December with their energy bills. So protests that are not happy about their purchasing power going down and not happy with the cost of living crisis, but the Belgian government is doing what it can to shore up those protesters' demands.
Alex, the other big story in Brussels, the ongoing investigation into allegations of corruption in the European Parliament. There's been a new development. What can you tell us?
Well, yeah, the European Parliament, that building behind me, there's obviously another European Parliament in Strasbourg as well. The latest development we've heard from Belgian authorities is that they seem to have found out about this particular scandal. I won't say stumbled into it, but certainly that wasn't the crux, the main crux of their investigation. It has been on this specific issue a 4-month search by the Belgian authorities, but it's been something that's been in the works for years. Now, it's quite well known that Brussels is a city with a lot of spies, with a lot of intelligence officers from a variety of different countries. That's not enormously surprising considering how much power and how much interest is concentrated in such a small city. But apparently the Belgian authorities were looking into undue influence by Chinese and Russian authorities when it comes to parliamentarians in the European Parliament. And that led them to investigating Eva Kaili, the Vice President of the European Parliament, her partner as well, who works for an MEP, and the others who were involved, this small network being discovered. And so that was the latest development. Just to remind you, Francesco Giorgi, who's Eva Kaili's partner, yesterday saying that he admitted to taking bribes from Qatar and from Morocco, but said that Ms. Kaili was not involved, not aware, and the reason why her father was caught lugging a suitcase of cash out of the house when the police raided it was because they had just found out about it and they were trying to hand in the evidence. That is the allegations from Giorgi, who's Kaili's partner, saying she wasn't involved. Nevertheless, she was stripped of her title by the European Parliament, that building behind me. So she is no longer serving Vice President of the European Parliament, and so the investigation will roll on. This scandal is not going anywhere anytime soon. It has rocked this city and Strasbourg in the last week, and it will continue to have investigations. Real strong reforms coming in from the European Parliament. This has been a problem for years, that lobbying and undue influence could be pressed on the European Parliament. So this story will rumble on, but those new developments is that actually the Belgian authorities were looking into undue influence from China and from Russia and stumbled onto this story and onto the corruption accusations on Qatar.
Alex, thank you for that. Our correspondent Alex Cartier in Brussels.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. So much for concern about the climate crisis. Global coal consumption hits an all-time high.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel and connect. How we think, interact and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
This week on Razor's Biodiversity Special, a community coming together to save an endangered species vital to fresh waterways, and scientists working to bring back one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet.
We scientists need to be actually out there trying to change things rather than studying the loss and the decline of these oceans that once supported us.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Just a reminder that CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV, online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
China says it'll aim to maintain economic stability in 2023. The policy update came from the annual Central Economic Work Conference in Beijing. General Secretary Xi Jinping spoke about the work done this year while laying out next year's tasks. He called for a proactive fiscal policy as well as a prudent monetary one. Officials want to work towards expanding domestic demand while also attracting foreign investment. They also stressed the need to prevent major economic and financial risks. Well, inflation slowed in the European Union in November. It was 11.1%. That's down from 11.5% in October. Prices increased 10.1% in November from a year earlier, down from 10.6% the previous month. France and Spain, by the way, had some of the lowest inflation, while Hungary and Latvia were higher. Energy and food, the biggest factors pushing up those prices.
Well, it's been a week of ups and downs in global markets after central banks in the United States, the UK and Europe all raised interest rates and warned of further increases to come in the fight to tame soaring inflation. Well, let's talk now to Susanna Streeter, who's a senior investment and markets analyst at Hargreaves Lansdown. Good to see you again, Susanna. Welcome back to the programme. So we've had a lot of data and some big decisions made this week. How have the markets been reacting to it all?
Well, in a disappointing manner, really. And it wasn't the rate rises themselves actually that sparked this sell-off. It's actually the forward guidance that central bank policymakers have been giving out, particularly the US Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank. Because what you're hearing from policymakers is that their work is not yet done and that more rate hikes will be needed to bring inflation under control. And because we had an easing off of the snapshot for inflation in the United States and in the UK, and as you're mentioning today in Europe, there have been hopes actually that central banks wouldn't have to raise rates quite so steeply. But now they're saying they are going to have to keep their foot on the pedal of rate rises until inflation is a lot lower. And that's really disappointed markets. And that's why you've seen a sell-off continue yesterday and today.
So Europe and the US signalling more rate hikes to come. How about the Bank of England? We've seen the 9th rate rise this year. Do you think that's the end of it, or will there be more to come here?
There will be more to come, but I don't think those rate hikes we're going to see in the future will be quite as steep and certainly not as many. Now the markets are forecasting that rates will go up by another 1% overall to, say, the middle of next year, so bringing the rate to 4.5% rather than 3.5% that we currently have. But inflation is still hot, 10.7% for the year. So that is why the Bank of England is still expected to keep on with those rate hikes. Although as a recession rolls in and the latest snapshot we've got of the economy through this PMI snapshot today shows that although activity did rise a little, it's still indicating that the UK is heading for recession, because we'll have had 2 consecutive quarters of contraction, and that should provide some kind of deflationary forces, a dampening down in demand in the economy, which is perhaps why the Bank of England isn't expected to stay on this rate hike path as correctly as the US Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank. And in many ways, the European Central Bank is still playing catch up.
So deflationary pressures on the way then. Do you think we are now at a point where inflation in the UK has peaked?
Yes, it does look like that, although the Bank of England policymakers are still pretty cautious, because although it's come down from 11.1% to 10.7%, obviously there could be bumps in the road ahead. But because energy prices have come down from those highs earlier in the year, we've also got other commodity prices, like wheat prices, also coming down, which should start feeding through, and also some indications that vacancies have reduced across the UK economy, which may mean that those wage demands might become a little bit quieter and that a wage spiral won't be setting in. So all of these are kind of early indicators that inflation should be on the way down, although it is going to take some time.
So we're getting into the Christmas period now, usually a busy time for retailers and for hospitality. Is it going to be a happy Christmas for them, though?
Well, we know already, because of the snapshot we've got on the high street, that retail sales fell in November. And actually, that was after a rise in October, which is a real disappointment, because it certainly seems as though Black Friday wasn't a bonanza for everybody. Although, interestingly, household goods stores, so furniture stores, actually did a little bit better. We saw a bit of a dip in second-hand sales, interestingly. But overall, certainly the volumes being sold don't match pre-pandemic times. So it does seem as though consumers are being a lot more cautious. And of course, for hospitality too, the UK has been hit by waves of strikes, not just postal workers and health workers, but crucially the railways. And that's why many in the hospitality business have been forecasting waves of cancellations, lots of bookings cancelled because of worries that people won't be able to get home due to these rail strikes. So it's not a particularly cheery time for the hospitality industry either.
Susanna, good to talk to you. Thank you for joining us. That's Susanna Streeter from Hargreaves Lansdown.
For the first time, United States market regulators are being allowed full access to audit documents from Chinese companies listed on Wall Street. Beijing says the deal is based on professional cooperation and mutual respect. Well, let's talk to our correspondent John Terrett, watching events for us in New York. John, well, high hopes for this audit deal then?
Yeah, on the face of it, Robin and Jamie, I think so. But don't get too excited, not too excited, because remember, this is Washington and Beijing we're dealing with, and you know that relationships have not been good for the best part of the 2 years that President Biden has been in office. And certainly people are rather taken aback, I think, some people are anyway, about the way the Biden administration has reacted towards China on various trade issues. I think they thought he was going to be a lot softer towards it than he's turned out to be. Anyway, this is the PCAOB, which is a quango, really, based in Washington, D.C. It's a public company accounting oversight board, which basically does what it says on the tin. In other words, it's a public company accounting oversight board. That's what they do. And the thing is, they've said within the last 24 hours that their members, who are over in Beijing now and have been since August, looking at Chinese companies that trade here at the New York Stock Exchange and at the NASDAQ, but which are based at home in Beijing, that they've been given full access to their books. And this is big-name companies, you know, like PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Ernst & Young, Deloitte, KPMG. They're all either over there, either because they have clients in Beijing or because they've been commissioned to be there. And it's all part of an agreement that was inked in August between Washington, D.C. and Beijing, which allowed US auditors to go to Beijing and look in an unfettered fashion at the books of the Chinese ADRs, those Chinese companies that trade here but which are based in China. And that phrase, full access, is very, very important because it removes now the threat of delisting. Up until this point, if things hadn't gone well, there was a threat that Chinese companies would be delisted from here in early 2023. And that, I think, is now definitely not going to happen. However, this is not a clean bill of health. Okay, the accountants and their trade body here, the representatives at the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, are not saying that all is well. In fact, they have said that they have found numerous potential deficiencies. And so issues were discovered and will require work in the future, understanding, cooperation and goodwill. But certainly at the moment, this is being taken as a very optimistic move.
Well, just with that caveat, who'd have thought peace and goodwill? I mean, how did this all come about?
It's taken 20 years. It's taken a very long time because Congress passed a law about 20-odd years ago basically saying, look, these Chinese companies, and it's not just Chinese companies, it's overseas companies that trade here but are based overseas under this ADR framework, which is a framework which allows people here to invest in these companies in the blink of an eye. They said all those years ago that you've got to be more transparent. And, of course, you know, they pass the bill, it gets put on a shelf, it gathers dust, nobody does anything about it. And then DD happened. And DD, I think, certainly as far as my contacts here on the floor are concerned, was the big changing point. This was in June and July of last year. DD is the rival to Uber. Uber had shares in DD. They wanted to expand overseas. They were told not to list on the New York Stock Exchange. They did list here. 2 days later, Beijing cracked down on their company based on technical issues, and the stock price fell by 40%. And people here were literally going, well, I don't think we'll be investing in any more Chinese companies in the future. Thank you very much. So the regulator, Gary Gensler, was very, very upbeat about this deal being signed last August, and the fact that by the time we knew about it in the media, the auditors were already in Beijing. He still does maintain that if things go badly wrong, that delisting threat is still there, or at least I think up until this past day or so, that threat was certainly there. Gensler's hoping all this will be a first stop on the road to much better cooperation. But this is the thing, this is why I say it's not all rosy in the garden, because all this happened within the last 12 to 24 hours. But yesterday, at the same time, the Biden administration clamped down on the Chinese memory chip maker YMTC and 21 others, broadening a blacklist of them. But at the same time, equally, they removed a Chinese ingredient maker for one of the COVID vaccines made by AstraZeneca and 25 other companies from what they call an unidentified list. So in many ways, we're kind of back to where we were before we was with this relationship between DC and Beijing. It still is contentious. It still is edgy. But this business about the auditors being there is being seen as a very good sign.
John, good to see you. Thanks for that. Our correspondent John Terrace in New York.
Retail sales in the UK fell last month as households continue to struggle with the rising cost of living. Sales were down 0.4% in November, a bigger drop than analysts had been expecting. Black Friday sales failed to boost spending, but there was a slight rise in food and drink sales. Retailers reporting that some shoppers stocked up early ahead of Christmas.
Good news, if you're a fan of the popular miniature tabletop game Warhammer 40,000, I knew you were, Amazon is planning to bring the video game to the big screen with British actor Henry Cavill starring and producing the adaptation. The e-commerce giant will join forces with British developer Games Workshop to produce a film and TV series. Shares in Games Workshop jumped over 15% on that news.
The International Energy Agency says coal use will reach an all-time high this year, and it's predicting that consumption will remain at similar levels over the next few years.
High gas prices caused by the war in Ukraine has seen countries scrambling for alternative fuel, but that alternative is cheap carbon emission-causing coal. I've been talking to Kingsmill Bond, an energy strategist at the Rocky Mountain Institute. I asked him whether coal is really making a comeback.
Don't worry, the energy transition is still completely on track. It's not a renaissance. It's a 1% increase in demand. It's pretty much what was expected this time last year. Nothing is new. All that's happened is that you've had a little bit of coal, gas to coal switching.
In the UK, I think we've had something like 3 or 4 days of very cold nights, no wind whatsoever, no input virtually from the wind industry. Companies like Germany will tell you they still believe they can eliminate coal as a power source by the year 2030, just 8 years away. Is that realistic?
So the most exciting development this year has been the extraordinary amount of attention and focus placed upon building out renewables and increasing efficiency. That's the real story. And so you've had a 30% increase in the expected amount of renewables deployment according to the IEA. You've had a massive increase in efficiency gains. You've had this huge amount of legislative change from the IRA in the US to Repower EU in Europe to the Chinese 14th five-year plan. Everything has now been galvanized to change the same way as we saw in the 1970s. So this kind of noise about short-term problems with coal, it is an issue, but actually the real story is elsewhere.
It's interesting, you know, people like you calling this a short-term fix, because when you look at the politicians commenting on this, for example, Czech Republic recently suggesting coal will now stay longer, to use their words, than the country's 2033 phase-out. And in Germany, one of the utility companies announcing it's postponing decommissioning of coal-fired power stations there. Doesn't feel like short-term.
Look, this is just, these are insurance policies. Coal is only 15% of electricity generation in Europe, going, you know, down to zero. If it's 0 or 1, doesn't really make that much difference. The really exciting point is that in the Repower EU, Europe is planning to double the amount of renewable electricity coming into the system. Europe's planning to solve the various permitting issues to drive more rapid change. That's the story here.
How concerned should we be, though, about this, you won't call it a renaissance, but this resurgence of coal? I mean, is the Paris climate agreement essentially dead?
So we should, of course, be concerned about any attempts to increase coal demand. But Paris is most certainly not dead. You have the shocks and the problems that we have faced this year, as in the 1970s, have galvanized very rapid change. So increase in efficiency, increase in renewables deployment, massive surge in electrification. So EV sales up, for example, this year by 50%. They're crossing the point of no return in all of the major markets. And now finally, hydrogen finally gets onto its extraordinary growth curve with a 7-fold increase in expected hydrogen deployment over the course of this year. So Paris is most certainly on track. We shouldn't be complacent. We have to fight every step of the way to get this stuff done. But no, it's not been derailed. This has not derailed Paris, that's for sure.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Cost of living crisis? What cost of living crisis? Some of us are buying more luxury shopping than ever before.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference? The difference is in the detail, in the background,
defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. 2 people killed in a wave of Russian missile strikes across Ukraine, with electricity supplies knocked out in its 2 largest cities. Our other headlines, thousands of people protest across Belgium as unions call a general strike amid the cost of living crisis.
Passengers in the UK are facing further travel disruption after members of the biggest rail union undertake another 48-hour strike.
This all comes as talks failed to resolve the long-running dispute over pay, jobs and conditions. Just 1 in 5 trains are now expected to run on Friday and Saturday, hitting services throughout England, Scotland and Wales.
Well, our correspondent Andrew Milson is here with us. So, Andrew, more strikes from the UK's railways and possibly more strikes ahead from the UK's nurses.
Yeah, so we're in the thick of it now. There's a momentum going behind these strikes. The most elaborate timetable comes from the rail workers, who've got another day of strikes today and tomorrow, as you mentioned, and more stoppages or go-slows or overtime bans pretty much every day through Christmas and on into January as well. There are some rail workers now who have accepted a deal from Network Rail, which is the company that runs the actual physical railway lines around the UK. The TSSA, a much smaller union than the union that's on strike at the moment today. They've accepted pay rises of 5% this year, 4% next year, and also a ban on any compulsory redundancies before 2025. Now, it's the same deal that's been put to the RMT, the union that's on strike at the moment. They've turned that down, but the other ones have, the other smaller union has accepted it. That's interesting because that puts an era of possibility into a situation that otherwise has always been filled with standoffs. However, the rail workers are committed and adamant that they're going to continue striking until they get what they want. The nurses feel their strike went well yesterday, that the public response was by and large positive and in support of their cause to increase their salaries, which haven't gone up since 2011, and also to improve conditions in that the number of nurses that are leaving the National Health Service is making their jobs very difficult. They've got another strike scheduled for the 20th, but they're saying that if the government doesn't meet with them before Christmas, they will have more days of strike action in January, and perhaps not just single days, but double days. Thus far, the hospitals have managed with the nurses being on strike with emergency care, but that may get more intense if they go into January.
So what kind of disruption are we looking at as we head into Christmas and New Year?
Well, for a start, it's across the board now. A lot of public sector workers are going on strike. So for the train workers and the nurses, we can add bus drivers, we can add driving instructors, we can add the Royal Mail, which will be striking on 23rd and 24th. We can the ambulance, which people are particularly concerned about. They're striking this Wednesday coming and the following Wednesday. Border Force, the people that process passports, people in and out of the country, part of the Home Office, they're also considering strikes. So the thing is widespread now, which means that people, the general public, are generally facing a difficult time in terms of moving around the country. And we've discussed this before, haven't we? That in the pandemic, of course, for different reasons, for lockdown reasons, people had a grim holiday season 2 years in a row. It looks like they might get affected again. How this might shift will be how much progress the strikers themselves are making. Strikers will look at other sectors and see how they're faring with their strikes, and this particularly why I mentioned the TSSA having their deal with Network Rail yesterday evening means that strikers will look at them and think, well, the bar has been set, we can at least push for for that much within our own sector, and also the public appetite for supporting. Now, I said that people were largely in support of the nurses, but that was one day. After another day, and perhaps more strikes into the new year, the government will be hoping that the appetite for the public to keep supporting these striking workers will fade away, and that'll be one of the mainstays of their industrial action strategy.
So you say that there are more or less strikes across the board, and newspapers here in the UK are warning of what they call a winter of discontent and a general strike. These were things that were talked about here in the 1970s. Are we there yet?
No, we're not. The general strike, the only time we've ever had a general strike where all public sector workers went on strike was 1926. All 1.5 million workers at the time, in a coordinated effort, all went on strike at the same time. That can't happen again because of legislation. It's not, workers are not allowed to go into different sectors to support striking. If you remember back in the 70s as well as back in the 20s, none of us, even Jamie, remember the 20s, of course, but you'll remember that there were things called secondary pickets, which people nicknamed flying pickets, which meant that you could have strikers from the rail workers who would go on the picket lines for the miners and support each other's efforts. That can't happen anymore by law. The 70s was still grimmer than we are now. Because there were power outages, there was a 3-day week, and there was rubbish not being collected in the streets. We're not there. But at this stage, it's still a little bit more organised than that in 2022.
I remember the 2020s, but not the 1920s. Andrew, thank you very much. Our correspondent, Andrew Wilson. Now, you thought there was a cost of living crisis, didn't you? But luxury shopping is roaring ahead.
Nearly half of all young adults in America are now living at home with mum and dad. And all that money saved on rent, bills and essentials is leaving more money in their pockets to spend on luxury items. It's this that's fueling a boom in the sector, according to research by Morgan Stanley. Well, Mario Ortelli is managing partner at Ortelli & Co., an advisory company specialising in the luxury goods market. Welcome back to the programme, Mario. So this research suggesting that young people living at home are driving this boom in luxury spending. Is that what you're seeing?
Yes, for sure. The younger customers are one of the biggest driver of the good performance of the luxury sector in the last year and in this month. These younger consumers are more interested in luxury probably than the previous generation because they use more digital media, they are more immersed in, they are more informed, they are more aware, and also they have got more discretionary income to spend because living with their parents or not buying a house, they can splurge more in luxury.
So we're seeing people buying luxury items in the US and Europe are becoming younger, but in Asia that's something we've been seeing for some time now. Why is that?
Asia was a growing market in which there was a more recent creation of wealth and was clearly polarized more in the younger generation. I would say now that the old world is following the path of China, in which more millennials and also Gen Z are becoming the consumer of today of luxury, and the older generation are becoming less involved in the luxury space.
So we've talked a lot about there being a cost of living crisis, a looming recession, but the luxury sector is still performing well, isn't it? Why does it tend to stay strong when, by and large, people are cutting back?
Because the luxury sector, first of all, involves just the richest consumer. According to the various research of the global population, just 4 or 5% are active consumer of luxury. As you can imagine, food, gasoline is taken by the world population. So the richest population has got also a higher level of asset. So they have got their decision of spend are also based on what they have got in bank account, not the salary that we get every month. And going forward, we expect that in 2023, the growth of the luxury sector will be more or less in the mid-single digit. If I look at the various estimates, they are ranging from 3 to 10%. And the biggest swinging factor are two, basically. How much strong will be the recession in Europe and America? And the second one is how the Chinese consumer will react to the COVID or post-COVID, as you want to call, measures in China.
Mario Ortelli from Ortelli & Co., thank you very much indeed for talking to us today.
Real pleasure. Bye.
An investigation is underway after 10 people, including 5 children, died in a fire at an apartment block in the French city of Lyon. Almost 200 firefighters battled to try to put out the blaze, which appears to have started on the ground floor before spreading. Our correspondent Mark Webster reports.
More than 170 firefighters battled to bring the blaze under control after it apparently broke out on the ground floor of the apartment block in the early hours of Friday morning and spread rapidly upwards. It took more than 3 hours to extinguish the flames. By then, at least 10 people had died, including 5 children who were aged between 3 and 15. The fire happened in a 7-storey building in Vaux-en-Velin suburb of Lyon, and the Interior Minister travelled to the scene after speaking to President Macron. He praised the bravery of the fire service personnel who managed to rescue residents of the building.
The origin of the fire is not yet known. The public prosecutor has opened an investigation in extremely dramatic circumstances, since we have 10 dead, 4 very seriously injured, whose lives are still in danger, and about 100 people involved.
One witness told a local paper that she was woken up by screams. She said she wanted to help, but the smoke was too thick. Another local man said he had been woken by a phone call.
A friend of mine called me this morning to ask what had happened. I was sleeping at the time and she told me about this sad event, which has touched all of us.
The neighbourhood has a reputation for urban decay and social deprivation, but is undergoing a multi-million-dollar renovation. The area near the fire was sealed off to allow investigators to start their work. Mark Webster, CGTN, Paris.
A landslide has ripped through a campsite in Malaysia, killing at least 21 people, including children. Mud poured down a hillside overnight into a farm where people were sleeping in tents. Officials say the campsite near Kuala Lumpur had been operating illegally. And hundreds of rescuers spent Friday digging through mud to find survivors. Around a dozen people are still missing.
A court in Peru has agreed to extend the detention of the country's former president by 18 months. A state of emergency has been declared where violent protests have taken place, calling for Pedro Castillo's immediate release. 15 people have died in the unrest. The former leader is being held while a case is being prepared against him on grounds of rebellion and conspiracy, charges which he denies.
Environment ministers are beginning negotiations at the COP15 summit in Montreal. China's President Xi Jinping has called for international cooperation on biodiversity. China has pledged a $216 million fund to help developing countries. Other countries, including Britain, have also agreed to increase funds. The summit's hoping to agree on protecting 30% of the Earth's land and seas.
One of the biggest aquariums in the world, housed in a hotel in Berlin, has burst, spilling 1 million litres of water and 1,500 tropical fish into the lobby and out into the street.
Hundreds of guests have been moved out, with 2 people injured by flying glass. Our correspondent Peter Oliver reports from Berlin.
Well, a major operation by firefighters, you can see just behind me, and hundreds of police and other emergency responders came to the scene here in central Berlin, where a aquarium, not just a aquarium, the largest freestanding cylindrical aquarium in the world, exploded in the early hours of Friday morning. Rude awakening for those guests. Shortly before 6 a.m, cracks appeared and then a huge crash as the pressure built up by the million litres of seawater that was in that aquarium spilled out into the foyer of the Radisson Blu Hotel, and then crashing out through the front doors, sending, sadly, the 1,500 tropical fish to whom the aquarium was home, and everything else that was in the aquarium, spewing out onto the main street here in Berlin. These streets, of course, as you can see, closed behind me as the operation continues, not just to try and clean up, but to try and find out what caused this. Because as it stands at the moment, investigators saying they don't know what led to this incident happening. It did result in 2 people requiring requiring medical attention from shards of glass, and of course, as I said, resulted tragically in the loss of all of the sea life that was in that aquarium at the time. In fact, the police tweeting out in response to the situation as it was unfolding that there was incredible maritime damage, as they put it. It does seem that everything that was inside of the aquarium has been lost. In terms of the investigation, though, we have seen incredibly cold temperatures here in Berlin in recent days, and they'll be looking to see if that had played any role in causing this incident to happen. The aquarium itself, a major tourism attraction here in Berlin. It was part of the way to get into the Sea Life Centre here in the German capital, a 10-minute or so elevator ride through this freestanding cylindrical aquarium was part of the experience there. All of this now, as you would imagine, closed as the clean-up operation continues, and as I said, the investigation to try and find out what caused it. It's a large-scale operation which is going on, and it looks like it'll continue for a little while yet. In Berlin, for CGTN, I'm Peter Oliver.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, sickness and injury cast something of a shadow over the final lineup between Argentina and France. We're in Doha next.
I fell in love with Chinese culture the second I started to experience it.
70 years ago, a small group of British businessmen travelled to China to unlock opportunities between the two countries. They became known as the icebreakers.
Building bridges is a natural thing. There is no age and gender difference in our spirit, no race difference in our soul.
I think food is an incredible way of bringing different cultures together. I am enjoying learning every aspect about it.
Chinese literature stretches back for millennia, but it's still really relevant for today.
I hope that Chinese and British fashion community could be more frequently communicating with each other.
An incredible mix of people, cultures, food, and there is so much to see and so much to do.
I have a great desire to make the Chinese civilization more accessible.
It's about our future generation's future.
The craftsmanship, the technique, the material uses, the color uses.
You can kind of take things on board and continue to develop and grow.
Meet the bridge builders, the individuals who dare to think beyond the horizon and open up our world.
Everything seems to have a story. I just think that's absolutely beautiful. A huge tick.
The story of the North Atlantic convoys and their heroic sailors has become part of British national identity. Less well known is that more than 1 in 7 of the merchant seamen who risked their lives crewing the convoys were Chinese, and that when the war ended, their loyal service was rewarded with betrayal.
She thought he'd just left her. And he didn't just leave her at all. And it came back and said, well, we can't find him.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe.
Anticipation is building ahead of Sunday's showdown between France and Argentina as they battle it out to be football world champions. Over 1 billion people watched France lift the World Cup trophy back in 2018, and FIFA are expecting those global television viewing figures to rise for this game.
Sickness is top of the French manager's mind as a virus has been making its way through the squad. France has imposed health and quarantine measures on the team to make sure all the top players are on the pitch on Sunday. There are no such concerns for Argentina, but its star player Lionel Messi did miss Thursday's training, but reports say he's not an injury worry.
Well, let's talk to our correspondent Dan Williams in Doha. Dan, this has been a controversial tournament, but FIFA's chief has been talking about Qatar. He called it the best ever.
That's right, yeah. He had his news conference today. His last one was
just before the tournament kicked off. And but today, yeah, as you say, calling it the best ever, saying as well that, yeah, just full of praise really for the way that Qatar has handled this tournament, saying that the matches have been played without incident, saying that they've been played with a joyful in a joyful atmosphere, and just talking about the incredible success of both on and off the pitch that Qatar has brought with this World Cup. Remember, of course, in the build-up to this tournament, there was a lot of controversy, certainly around workers' migrant rights and other controversies as well. But Infantino saying that, quick to point out the legacy elements of this World Cup, saying that it was right to bring the tournament to the Middle East, defending that, and saying that a lot of the fans that come here have been able to enjoy themselves in an environment they probably would not have otherwise been exposed to. This is what he had to say in his news conference a short while ago.
I think already now that the transformative legacy of this World Cup is that many people from around the world have come to Qatar and have discovered the Arab world which they didn't know, or they knew only for what was portrayed to them.
Well, there was also some other business as well that Infantino was quick to point out as well, expanding the Club World Cup to 32 teams from 7. That's, of course, a tournament that has all the club sides, the likes of Real Madrid and Inter Milan and Liverpool and Manchester United and the like. That from 2025. And talking about the 2026 World Cup, remember, that's already going to be 48 teams. He's talking about now, though, potentially having 12 groups of 4 teams as opposed to 16 groups of 3. That was the original idea, saying that the group stage here, given all the drama that we saw here, that needs another rethink, and maybe keeping it at the group of 4 instead of more groups of 3.
Dan, obviously anticipation building, but sickness obviously a worry. How are France and Argentina lining up?
Yeah, France, they already had some injury concerns and some illness in the camp for their semi-final. But yeah, another couple of players going down with illness now. We're not 100% sure yet whether it will impact whether they are able to play in the final on Sunday. We expect to hear more at the news conference on Saturday. But certainly, yeah, it's a big concern, of course, for France. If all things are considered, though, this is, of course, going to be a potential classic. We're talking about, once again, Lionel Messi of Argentina up against Kylian Mbappe of France. Of course, it's the storyteller. That's the kind of the main focus of the story. But there are so many different plot lines, of course, in this. Will Messi win his first ever World Cup? Can France have back-to-back titles? And certainly, even before that, though, we have this third, fourth playoff match as well. Croatia up against Morocco. Morocco, the team, of course, of this tournament. They've lit up this World Cup. First Arab nation to reach the semi-final. First African team to reach the semi-final as well. So that third, fourth playoff game is on Saturday. They've already met once at this World Cup. It was a goalless draw in the group stage, but we expect certainly the crowd to lift Morocco one last time in that game as well.
Dan, we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks for that. Our correspondent Dan Williams in Doha.
The headlines again. 2 people killed in a wave of Russian missile strikes across Ukraine, with electricity supplies knocked out in its 2 largest cities.
Our other headlines, thousands of people protest across Belgium as unions call a general strike amid the cost of living crisis.
And another strike by railway workers hits the UK. Talks to try and resolve the dispute on pay and conditions fail.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Preview.
We'll see you again on Monday, same time, same place. From all the team here in London, it's goodbye.
Bye.